Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today on why stories matter with Story Collider. Very excited to have you all here. While we're waiting on folks to join, I just want to go through a couple of logistics, which if you've attended a CGS webinar before, you're probably familiar with. The first, that please do submit any questions that you may have using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Makes it a lot easier for us to answer your questions. Feel free to use the chat to converse with your fellow attendees. It's a little harder for us to catch questions if they're in there. This is being recorded, so the recording and the slides that our speaker will use will be emailed to anyone who registered, as well as being posted on the CGS website and the YouTube channel after the live event. And without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce why stories matter. And this is a webinar with Story Collider. And today we have our speaker, Erin Barker, presenting today. So Erin is the founder of Why Stories Matter. She is the executive director as well. And the Story Collider is a science storytelling organization with an award-winning weekly podcast. As a storyteller, Erin was the first woman to win the Moth Grand Slam storytelling competition twice, and her stories have been featured on public radio several times, including on PRX's The Moth Radio Hour and on podcasts such as The Moth, Risks, Family Ghosts, and many more. One of her stories was included in the New York Times bestselling book, The Moth, 52 Stories, and she now lives in New York City with her husband and daughter. And Erin, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce the Story Collider and share what you have to share with us today.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here. I will go ahead and pull up my slides here so I can dazzle you all with my PowerPoint artistry. Uh, it's very nice to see all of you today. Today, I'm going to share with you a little bit about Story Collider, our work, why we believe so much in the power of true personal stories, and I'll walk you all through the process of building a story yourself. Now, this is going to be a pretty quick version of what we typically do in our workshops, which are usually 6 to 8 hours. But I think you will still come away with a rough idea of the tools of storytelling and maybe the seeds of a story that you can share yourself. And at least hope a better sense of why stories matter so much to science and to science education. So this is me 15 years ago when I was a child. I made that joke in a past webinar, and I think somebody believed me, so I should clarify. I'm probably 25 or 26 here. But this is at one of Story Collider's first shows in Brooklyn. I'm here with my co-founder, Ben Lilly, who is a physicist. I first met Ben after I moved to New York. Hoping to have a career in publishing. I ended up taking a class on storytelling, and that was where I met Ben. And Ben was a physicist who had recently decided to stop being a physicist and move to New York and go into theater, which I found very interesting because people don't often make decisions like that where I'm from. So I was instantly fascinated. And he had this dream of starting a storytelling show where folks got up on stage and they shared true personal stories about how science had affected their lives in some way, whether they were scientists or comedians or journalists or whatever background they may have. He believed that everyone had a story about how science had impacted them in some way. And I thought this sounded so boring. Because I do not have a science background. I was not interested in science at the time. And I thought, oh, poor Ben, this is just so specific. This is never going to work out. But he put together this show out in Queens. And so I went because I'm a very good friend, as I think you can tell. And I was really surprised how blown away I was by the stories because at the end of the day, science stories are really human stories. And these were stories of love, of passion, of triumph, of failure, of defeat, and all of the things that we all feel so universally every day. And I had never heard science discussed in that way before. And I sort of fell in love with the idea that we could take this subject, which in other contexts I had never really been able to connect with, and put it into this context where it became really real and vibrant for me and for other people like me. So I got involved. I started helping out in the show, and Ben and I, together with our third co-founder, Brian, ended up turning Story Collider into a nonprofit organization in 2012. And today we put on shows all across the US, the UK, and Canada, just like this one in San Antonio, where folks of all backgrounds share 10-minute true personal stories about how science has affected them. And some of these stories are funny, some of them are moving, some of them are adventurous. They kind of run the gamut in terms of their tone. And every week, every Friday, we air a selection of these stories that we record at our live events on our podcast, and it goes out to thousands of people all over the world. And over the years, we've also taken the coaching practice that we use to prepare our storytellers for the stage, and we've turned it into an education program. So we run workshops for science professionals of all kinds, for universities and laboratories, and for educators, and we also offer coaching as well. So, what makes us believe so much in the power of true personal stories that we've built this whole nonprofit organization around this idea and that we are advocating for it so fervently through these three programs? Well, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there's a need for us to share stories about science. And this is one of the studies that we always go to in our workshops when we're talking about why we should share stories. This is from Fisk and Dupree. And Fisk and Dupree had this idea that when we meet someone for the first time, we instantly form a snap judgment about them based on two factors, their warmth and their competence. So how warm they are, what are their intentions toward us? Do they value the same things that we value? Or how competent they are, like how capable are they of carrying out those intentions? And based on those two factors, we form an impression of people right away. And Fisk and Dupree have this idea that in order to be an effective expert in any field, we need to have both warmth and competence at our disposal. So they ended up asking the participants in their study to rank various professions or types of people based on their warmth and competence. And they placed them across this matrix. And they found that when we feel someone is warm and competent, we admire them, we want to follow them, we want to be involved in what they're involved in. When we perceive someone as being warm, but maybe not so competent, we pity them. When we don't feel they're competent or warm, we feel disgusted by them. And when we feel that they're perhaps very competent but not so warm, we feel envy toward them. And here's the thing, when they rated these different professions, where do we think scientists might have fallen on this matrix? Do we have any guesses in the chat? Wah, wah. Unfortunately, it's right up here in the competent but not so warm category. Yeah, it looks like you guessed it, Monica. And so a lot of scientists in our workshops will say, well, what's the problem with that? I don't mind being envied. That doesn't sound so bad. Well, the problem with that is they put sensors on their participants' faces and they told them sort of little stories about people in different parts of this matrix and sort of minorly bad things happening to them. For example, getting splashed by a bus on their way to work. And when they told their participants a story like this about people up here in the envy quadrant, they found that their participants would smile in response. In other words, they would feel schadenfreude about that. And that's not really the response that we want to engender in our audience, really. We want them to be rooting for us. So if we're already perceived as competent, what are some ways that perhaps we can be perceived as more warm to move from this envy quadrant to this admiration quadrant? Well, I think the answer to that question is we can share a little bit of ourselves. We can share our stories. We can share our humor, our humility. We can share a little bit about the experiences that we've had and what is really meaningful to us. And that's where storytelling comes in. There's so much research that has found that narratives are more interesting, more understandable, more believable, and more persuasive than argument-based forms of communication. And I believe this is more important than ever for us to understand. The way that narratives connect events in our minds makes them very logically more understandable and just more easy to wrap our heads around. So the way that we define stories at Story Collider is just like this: believable characters, experiencing meaningful events, who must cope with the consequences. And I'm going to take you through each of these three elements today, and we'll do a few activities, and hopefully you'll be able to uncover each of these elements of the story for yourself. And we'll start with events, as we always do at Story Collider. So first, we're going to brainstorm for just a minute. And this is a brainstorming exercise that we use quite a lot. There are a number of ways to brainstorm stories. I often ask folks telling stories at Story Collider to think of a moment when they changed how they thought about their work or they changed their approach to their work. And that tends to inspire some interesting stories. Starting with change is never a bad idea, especially if you can think of a specific moment of change. Also, gravitating toward big emotions. It's usually an indicator that there's a story there. If you can remember a time you felt a big emotion and connection with your work, such as joy or anger or sadness. But this is a pretty straightforward brainstorming exercise that I'd like to ask you to do today. If you have a piece of paper, somewhere to type, you could just jot this down real quick. First, last, best, worst. And you can use this exercise with pretty much any topic. A lot of storytellers use it with things like birthdays or dates. You think of what was your first date like? What was your last date like? Your best date, your worst date, and just jot down a little idea there. Today, for the purposes of this webinar, I'd like you to think about days at your job or in your program, or if it feels more relevant, science classes. Think of your first day at this job, your last day at this job, your best day, your worst day, and just jot down a few notes real quick. It will probably be that some of these aren't too interesting, but hopefully at least one of them will be. So I'll give you a few seconds just to think about that. And feel free to share some of these in the chat. I would love to see what you come up with. After you've had a chance to jot a few down, see if one of these seems more interesting to you than the others. And you can work with that today for the purposes of our exercises. And throughout all of these exercises, typically in a story collider workshop, we'd be splitting off into breakout groups to discuss each of these things. But since we're in webinar mode today, please feel free to share in the chat. Would love to see what everybody comes up with. All right, so hopefully we have an idea or two here. It doesn't have to be a perfect idea because this is just for the purposes of these exercises today, just to help you learn these tools of storytelling. But hopefully there's something kind of interesting. And we're going to go through these elements of the story, events, characters, and consequences, and I'll ask you to think of that idea as we go through each exercise. But for now, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about events, this first element of story. So this is a photo that we often use at Story Collider. It's a very memorable photo, the cow on the fence. And the way this came about was I was working on a story and I sent it to one of our board members at the time, Steve Zemmer, who's a very successful storyteller here in New York City. And I asked him for some notes on my story. And this image is what he sent me in response. And I said, Steve, I think I'm going to need a little bit more context here to understand what you're trying to say. And he explained to me that this is a photo of tension in a story. We know what this cow wants. It wants to get to the other side of the fence. We know what's in its way, the fence, and we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how the cow is going to overcome this obstacle. We don't know if it is going to get what it wants. And this is an incredible moment of uncertainty in the life of this cow. I think sometimes as storytellers, particularly in science where there is so much pressure, I think, to be perfect, we tend to tell stories by showing our cow on one side of the fence and then jumping to show it on the other side of the fence. But this tension of the cow being on the fence, this is where the real story is. This is a much more interesting photo than a photo just of a cow in a field on one side of a fence, right? And it's interesting because of that uncertainty, because we don't know what's going to happen. And that's what folks will always gravitate to in your stories, these moments of tension and uncertainty, where we know what the storyteller wants, but not quite how they're going to get it. So in your stories, you should try to get the cow on the fence as early as possible and keep the cow on the fence as long as you can until the end of the story to maintain that tension. We'll come back to this in a little bit. But this is a very interesting study that kind of shows the impact of keeping an audience in tension. It's actually a series of studies from some Japanese scientists. And they measured an audience's eye blinks. I believe in the case of at least one of these studies, it's in response to an episode of Mr. Bean, which I love. And they found that when an audience is in tension, their eyes will open wide. And when that tension is relaxed, that's when they blink. And they found that audiences watching something together, their eye blinks will become synchronized as they're in tension at the same time, which I find very interesting that we can all be experiencing this collectively. Well, one of the most important studies that we cover in our workshops is the study of transportation, which is something that psychologist Melanie Green has studied quite extensively. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the concept of transportation, but transportation is essentially that state that you're in when you're completely immersed in a story, a book, or a movie, and you're so into that book that you don't hear somebody calling your name, or you don't notice the time going by in the movie theater. It's when your entire mental world is taken up by the story. And what Melanie found is that when we are transported into a story, our emotions will fluctuate up and down with those of the main characters. And that when we are transported into a story, there are a couple of results afterwards. Folks who experience this transportation will be more likely to return to the story later, will be more likely to share it with others. and will be more likely to look into the subject matter of the story later on their own. And that's obviously the type of impact that we want to inspire in our audience, whether they're our students or whether we're giving a public talk. We want to inspire them to want to share what we're talking about, to want to look into it more on their own. So how do we transport people into a story? I have a clip.
So I reached back.
Accidentally played it too soon. I have a clip that I'd like to play from a storyteller named David Evans. He is a paleontologist. I'll just make sure I'm sharing sound real quick. There we go. And I want you to notice how the audience responds as he tells this story. And just to set up this clip real quick, this clip begins when David and his team, they've been in the field looking for dinosaur fossils, and they're starting to get very frustrated. They're not really finding what they had hoped to find. And sort of out of frustration, they've just started throwing rocks around. And that's where this clip starts.
So I reached back into the cliff rather than picking a rock from the ski slope, and I just pulled a rock from the cliff. And before I hucked it, I looked at it. And it's a good thing. I was holding in my hand a perfectly preserved dinosaur egg, just like the ones that Kitching had found 30 years earlier. And my jaw dropped. And without saying a word, I just turned to Hillary. And she looked at me, and she looked at what was in my hand, and her jaw just dropped. And I just retraced the arc of my arm from where I had picked up that rock in the cliff face, and we turned, and beside it was the outline of another egg, and another egg, and another egg. 6 eggs in a perfect line. We had found a dinosaur nest.
All right. So I'd love to hear from you all in the chat. If there's anything in particular that you noticed in this clip from David, I have the text up on screen now, just to refresh our memories as we discuss it. But I would love to hear your observations, if anything stood out to you. When David first worked on this story, this part of the story was just a couple of sentences. It was sort of just well, after some frustration, we did end up finding a dinosaur nest, and it led to this important research. And that was that. But you can see how much more interesting it is when David takes us into that moment with him, when he leads us along this process of discovery along with him, and we get to see his reaction and Hillary's reaction. And you can hear the audience laughing and gasping along with him, and getting to be transported into that moment and experience it along with him. That's a unique power of storytelling. And it's a unique power of building a scene for our audience. If he had just summarized it in a couple of sentences, we wouldn't have been able to have that joy of going on that journey of discovery with him. Okay, so now we're on to the second element of story, consequences. Consequences are what give events meaning. When we see this cow on the fence, we don't know what the consequences are going to be for this cow. We don't know if it's going to be a happy ending, the cow makes it to the other side of the fence, unfortunate ending, or something that we couldn't have anticipated at all. It's all up in the air. And what the story means will depend on what that conclusion to the cow's story is. So I'm going to play you a couple of clips right now from a couple of storytellers to show you how they've established meaning and stakes in their stories. And these two clips are very different, but I think both of these storytellers do a great job of establishing what's at stake. So we'll start here with Alice Fleerackers. And to set up this clip, I think all you need to know is that she is G-chatting with a colleague about a grant proposal.
She asked me to give it a final proofread before we submit it, to check that she ticked all the boxes, met all the guidelines. And I got right to it. Pressed my nose up against the computer screen, cross-checking every single line against the teeny tiny font of the government funding website. I was just giving it a last pass when I saw it. Uh-oh, big mistake. I hop onto GChat, the very nerdy form of Facebook Messenger that was our preferred way of communicating. Hey, this looks great. I just noticed one thing. I was so glad I caught it. This seemed like the most important part of the grant. You're missing that bit about the significance of your research, why this matters for the world. I wait, watching that horrible little ellipses you see when somebody is typing, you know, the dot, 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 and you can't do anything until they respond. Finally, she writes back, "Oh, that? Don't worry, I'll send you some wording from another grant. We can just copy it over. People usually write something about extending our understanding of the world. It's not that important." I close chat, push myself away from the computer, and just sit staring at the gray concrete wall in front of me for a little bit. Not that important? I feel my heart growing a little heavier and just like slowly oozing its way down into my stomach. Not that important? The walls start to grow a little closer. The air gets cooler. The light suddenly starts to grow dimmer. Not that important? The whole point of our research was not that important? This thing we'd been working for together on for so many months was not that important? Was it just another line to add to our CVs? Was this just another thing to make my grad school proposal stand out a little more from the crowd?
All right, so that's Alice. And you can see how this moment objectively is somewhat of a small moment in time, right? She's just having a GChat conversation with a colleague working on a proposal. But you can see how Alice has infused this moment with stakes. And I would love to hear from you in the chat if you have any thoughts about how Alice has brought stakes into this story. But you can see the type of imagery that she uses to bring us into her mindset. She says her heart grows heavier and oozes down into her stomach. Now, that's not literally true, but it shows us a lot about how she feels in that moment, about how important this is to her. And that's a key thing about storytelling. If we know that what's happening is important to the storyteller, it becomes important to us. It doesn't need to be objectively important in the grand scheme of things necessarily. A GChat exchange is probably not important in the grand scheme of things, but it's important to Alice. And so we care. We're on board. Now here's quite a different clip from Rehana Maktoufi, one of our former producers. And in this clip, Ray has just been hit by a car and she's in the hospital. And I think that's all you need to know to set up this clip. But think about how Ray establishes stakes in this moment and how it's different from Alice's.
So the police comes in and suddenly this memory that I have from the room is just, the room is so much bigger and my bed is so much smaller and really long. And at the end of the bed, this police is standing and next to him, my husband. And I'm just like tiny on this bed. And he's asking me questions about my accident. And I have a really vague memory of it. So I'm just like trying to tell him what happened. And he's writing things down. And it just feels like he's a doctor writing things down, waiting to tell me I'm dying. Like that's how it felt. So he keeps writing things, and then he's done. And then he tears this piece of paper, and he gives it to me, and he says, so here's your ticket, because you jaywalked. And this is a court date and time, and you will be attending the court. And I'm like, excuse me? Court? A ticket? I am thinking that I'm an immigrant. At that point, I have been waiting for my green card to come for around 3 years for no good reason, something that should have taken me 6 months. So I'm thinking, oh, great. On top of all this resume that they're looking at it to see if they want to give me a green card or not, there's going to be a ticket and a court case and everything and crime and prison, and just like I'm thinking more and more. And I'm just crying, and I say, what does that mean? Why do I have to court? Is this going to affect my immigration? Am I going to be deported? And I'm just crying. And he's like, no, this is like a petty crime. And he looks at my husband, and he says, do they have petty crimes in Iraq? And my husband furiously looks at him, and he says, Iran. She's from Iran. Yeah. Do they have petty crimes in Iran? And I'm confused, and I keep crying, and that's over.
All right, so I would love to hear your observations about this clip from Ray, too, because I think this is another clip that is really infused with stakes. We understand why this moment is so important to Ray. We understand exactly what her worst fears are, what will happen if things don't go well. And we understand what's important to her in this moment and what she wants. That's very true, Monica. Yeah, they're both situations that we can all relate to on a human level in some way. Yeah, I hear that, Ola, for sure. Yeah, I think that Ray makes it very clear what's at stake for her in this moment. And she also, sort of similar to Alice, brings us inside her head when she talks about, how long the hospital bed is and how small she feels in this moment. It gives us a sense of how she is feeling and her mentality. So you can see objectively, I think the stakes in Ray's story are a little bit higher in terms of she's in the hospital, she's facing a ticket, she's concerned about her immigration status, and she does an amazing job articulating it. But the stakes in Alice's story are just as clear, even though objectively it's a smaller stakes story. And however these stories end, that'll be what gives these stories meaning. If Ray's story ends with deportation, that's going to mean something very different than if it ends with her safely making it out of the hospital. If Alice's story ends with her successfully convincing her team to figure out why this proposal is so meaningful to them, that's going to be very different than if the ending causes Alice to become more cynical, right? Each of those stories means very different things. All right, so now we're on to characters, the final element of our story. And so I want to talk about why it is so important that we share ourselves as scientists, that we share our identities. This is a research paper that was published, I think in 2016. Yeah, it says here on the slide, 2016. And it's been replicated many times since then by scientist Jeff Shinsky and his team from the Scientist Spotlights Initiative. And as part of this study, what they did was they had community college students in an intro-level science course listen to some Story Collider stories or other biographical stories about scientists over the course of a semester as part of their coursework. And what they found as a result was that those students who had had this assignment in their class reported that they could see more of a place for themselves in science. They reported more interest in science. They had a less stereotyped view of who could be a scientist. And they actually also got a better grade in the class than the students in other intro science courses who did not have this assignment. And that was really exciting to us at Story Collider because it showed us that when we see what's possible for ourselves, it can unlock so much potential. And it's exciting to us that understanding who scientists are, who can be a scientist, and the different opportunities in science can give folks this kind of motivation and this ability to see a place for themselves. And we have also participated in an NSF-funded study at Boise State University, where engineering undergraduate students construct their personal narratives as part of Story Collider workshop. And they found that those students identify more as scientists after they work on their narratives and share them with their class, and that they're more likely to be retained within their program, and that those impacts are especially pronounced for those from underrepresented backgrounds in engineering. So it's really exciting to us, the power that storytelling has in these capacities. Now, here's a study that some of you might be familiar with. This one is from Fermilab, but this is the Draw a Scientist study. They do this, I think, every year. This one is from Fermilab many years ago. And they had students, middle schoolers, draw what they thought a scientist looked like. And so you see we have a lot of white men, a lot of glasses, a lot of unfortunate hair, jackets with way too many buttons. I think these students really overstated the need for buttons in science. Also holding a lot of dangerous chemicals. I think one student had even written in a little bubble caption by one of his scientists said, "Now I will destroy the world." And after they had the students draw this, they took them on a field trip to Fermilab where they spent the day with scientists. And then afterwards, they asked them to draw what they thought a scientist looked like again. And these are the exact same students who drew the previous 3 photos. And you can see now they're drawing women, they're drawing people of color, they're wearing casual clothes with many fewer buttons, they're looking a little bit more approachable, they're smiling. You can see what a difference it makes getting to know these scientists as people rather than just as scientists. One of the students, I think, even wrote on his, "I didn't know scientists like ping pong too." So when we share who we are as people, when we share what we like, what we value, it allows us to present as warmer for our audience. So here's a clip from Latasha Wright, who is a member of our board, a biologist and chief scientist of BioBus. And I'd like you to listen to the way that she establishes herself as a character in her story, because I think she does it really effectively here. And I'd like to hear your thoughts.
And my brothers and my dad would put crabbing lines out to catch crabs, and I would just run wild on the beach and go crazy and, kind of primal. And I would think about like all of the animals in the water, and I would fantasize about them, and I would think about what they are doing, or who are they hanging out with. And I was obsessed with dolphins. I loved them. I thought they were beautiful, they were smart, and, obviously just like me. So I wanted to be one. And I wanted to be one so bad that I had a dolphin name. And and I had, okay, don't tell anybody, this is a total secret. But I had a dolphin name that was a lot of clicks and whistles. And I made my whole family call me by this name. So don't tell anybody. I can trust. And so then that just meant I was going to be a scientist, okay? Because I was not this flipper crap, like a real thing.
All right, that's Latasha. What do we notice about the way that Latasha introduced herself here? Do we have an impression of who she is? Are there any words that we might use to describe her based on this? I think it's pretty clear from this that Latasha is a funny person, a silly person. Yeah, creative and enthusiastic, definitely true. Now, Latasha doesn't tell us at the start of her story here, I'm a funny, silly, creative, and enthusiastic person, right? That would be much less interesting. Instead, she shows us who she is by giving this example from her childhood, showing us also how passionate she is about science, that she has had this deep love for it since she was a child. And so I think we not only get a sense of who Latasha is, from this clip, we also get a sense of what her story might be about. So I have one last exercise for you all. This is how we work on showing instead of telling who we are as characters in our story. Tell me you're blank without telling me you're blank. Maybe you've seen this meme online before. So think about who you might be in that story that you brainstormed earlier. Who are you at the start of that story? Fill in that blank with how you would describe yourself at the start of that story. Now think about how you could show that without spelling it out necessarily. And the way that Latasha showed us that she has this long-running passion for science and that she is a funny person without telling us that explicitly. And if you have any ideas, I would love to see those in the chat as well for how you might show your character. But this was a very quick introduction to some of our principles of storytelling at Story Collider. We go much more in depth in our longer workshops. So if you're interested in learning more, we'd love to see you in one of our workshops. You can find out more about them at storycollider.org/education. We offer public workshops. We have a couple right now. One is starting in April and one, I believe, in June that you can sign up for. And we also will private workshops for universities, laboratories, patient groups, groups of all kinds. You can look into that as well. In the past couple of years, we've been developing what we call a higher education curriculum that is specifically for STEM educators, and talk about how to integrate storytelling into the classroom. And we leverage some of the work that has been done by scientists like Jeff Shinsky and the Scientist Spotlights Initiative, as well as our friends at Boise State, to take folks into examples of how stories have been used in the classroom before and how they can apply them to their own classrooms. So if that's something that you're interested in, please do reach out. We'd also love to hear your stories. We have regular shows in a number of cities across the US, Canada, and the UK, and we also do remote recordings for our podcast if folks are outside any of our geographic locations. So if you have a story idea, maybe you started the seed of one today in this webinar, please do let us know. Give us a pitch at storycollider.org/submissions. We'd love to hear from you. Or you can email stories@storycollider.org if you're more comfortable. But in any case, please feel free to reach out with any questions that you might have. You can use that address right there, stories@storycollider.org. I'm always happy to talk about stories and nerd out about stories. So I think we're a little bit early. for the Q&A.
We are just a little bit early, but I think if you are wrapped up, I certainly have a lot of questions. And I also saw that CGS President Suzanne Ortega was able to join us just a little bit late. Suzanne, I want to make sure that I give you the floor if you would like it to ask any questions you may have. Suzanne?
Well, first of all, Erin, this was lovely. And colleagues who are on the webinar know that we're deeply appreciative of the work Story Collider does. The power of narrative to change minds and hearts and interest. I was indeed thinking about my first oh no in science class when I couldn't get the microscope focused so I could identify the 4 types of algae that I just knew were under there.
Oh no.
It didn't end up with me becoming a botanist. I will tell you, but it was an interesting story. Anyway, I'd love to let our participants ask questions, Erin, and I thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I did notice something that came through in the chat. I've seen some of y'all have been chatting to the hosts and panelists, and one of that was a comment about how your examples delivered their stories. It was really dynamic, really engaging, often very, very funny. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that aspect of delivery and how people sort of embody and pause and express and really the act of being a good storyteller once you have that really good story.
Yeah, so the main thing that we always encourage folks on our stage is to be themselves, which is sometimes frustrating advice, but we don't want anyone to get up and use what I like to call the scientist voice. When you're telling a story, it's kind of you wave your hands like this and you say, first I will tell you about this, and then I will tell you about this, and there's nothing like that voice to really cause people's eyes to glaze over at our show. They really want to hear you being genuine and really connecting with them as a human being. So they want to hear about you, the real authentic you. And anything that makes it seem inauthentic will shut them down immediately. So I advise you to be yourself, talk the way that you normally talk in conversation, as you would over a cup of coffee or over a drink with a friend. And I would also suggest, as you alluded to, Sarah, pausing in moments of drama and important moments of your story, really taking your time to show the audience that there's gravity in this moment, or maybe in moments where there's some anxiety or some excitement, you speed up a little bit, you get a little bit louder. So let yourself inhabit the emotions and the attitude of those moments. Don't act them out or do characters or anything like that. But just let yourself be present in the moments that you're describing, and it'll go a long way towards making the audience feel like they're there with you.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And then we've got a question from Maya in the Q&A asking about, which is also a question I shared, which is, who is the audience and how do you figure out the audience you're potentially reaching out to? Because there's a variety of typical audiences. So the question specifically is, who is the typical audience? I'm not sure if that's who's Story Collider's typical audience, but I think there's perhaps a broader question about how do you meet your audience when you're telling a story?
So at Story Collider, we consider our target audience to be people who are interested in science, but don't necessarily feel included in it. Maybe for some reason they don't feel like they can be a part of conversations about science. Maybe it's because they got a C in biology in high school, or maybe it's because they consider themselves to be artistic or creative, or for whatever reason, they don't feel like they're a part of science. And so we want to invite people in through personal stories in the same way that I was invited in that very first show that I went to with Ben. And so it can be difficult sometimes to figure out who your podcast audience is. as anyone who podcasts knows. But we have done a few audience surveys in the past. We know quite a few of our listeners are grad students who listen while pipetting and doing various other tasks. But we also know quite a few of our listeners are long haul truckers looking for stories to listen to as they drive across the country. So it really runs the gamut. And I think that's the power of what personal stories have to offer is even if a science podcast isn't something that you would typically listen to, I think most people are interested in other people. And what our audience has told us is that they're particularly interested in learning about the behind the scenes of science, you know, those little adventures and mistakes and trials and errors that happen that we don't necessarily get to read about in the articles and the headlines that we see in the newspapers. I think people are really interested to know what it's actually like to work in science.
Wonderful. I really liked what you said about how it's we are all interested in learning about other people. That really resonated with me. I've got another question in the Q&A here from Maya. How do you navigate the potential of discussing triggering stories?
Yeah, that is something that we think about quite a lot, especially in the past 5 years. I will say it's arisen more often. We have a rule at Story Collider that is we talk about scars and not wounds. So we never want anyone to go on stage telling a story that is coming from a wound rather than a scar. So something could be traumatic that has happened to you, but we want it to have been healed and processed and reflected on before it makes it to stage. We want it to be a scar. We don't want it to be unhealed, still bleeding, still figuring things out when it makes it to the stage. And so we can assess this in a few different ways. If someone isn't comfortable editing their story from kind of an objective perspective, that's usually a sign that perhaps things are a little bit too emotionally fraught still to be comfortable telling that story. If they're avoiding the editing process, if it's difficult for them to talk about, that's another sign. So we try to really make sure people are taking care of themselves. We never want anyone to be talking about something traumatic for the first time on stage. We want to keep them safe and we want to keep our producers safe from that perspective as well. Now, when we do have those stories on stage, I think there are a few different ways to handle them. Depending on what that subject matter is, we do try to give a content warning on our shows and on our podcast so that people can take care of themselves however they need to. And we try to consult with the storyteller about that content warning so that it feels authentic to their story and so that they understand that it's coming before their story because we feel that often it comes best from the storyteller themselves. But yeah, that is something that comes up quite a bit these days.
I'm sure it does. Thank you for that. That's a really thoughtful answer. We've got just a few minutes left, and I want to ask a question that I noted I was thinking about and reflecting on while you were speaking, which was that right now, this is a moment where for graduate education, a lot is at stake. And I think a lot of what we're hearing at CGS and a lot of our members are very, very concerned about the current moment and what it means for graduate education. So I was wondering if you could speak to how we use story to meet a moment where so much is at stake.
Oh, wow. Yeah, big question.
I know.
Yeah, I think we all have the opportunity right now. I think each of us probably has a story that we can share that can make a difference, that can make somebody think about something differently, or that can make somebody feel a little bit less alone. And like I said earlier in the webinar, stories have a unique power compared to argument-based forms of communication. Stories are a little bit harder to argue with. It's harder to discount someone's personal experience than it is to discount somebody's intellectual argument a lot of times. And they reach people in a way that arguments don't. They allow people to bring down those defenses, those gut reactions, and just enter into your experience. And as we did with, David, the paleontologist in the field, go on that journey with them and experience just a little bit of what it's like to be them. And I think that it's very powerful. I know that most of the time when folks have changed their minds about something, it is because somebody has shared their experience, has shared how something has impacted them in a certain way. I know that's true for me, and I think that's true for many people. So I think for those of us in graduate studies right now, I would suggest that you, whenever it's safe and you can, that you share your stories of how you are impacted by current circumstances, that you empower your students to be able to tell their stories, because I think it's a very powerful thing to be able to articulate who you are and where you're coming from to folks in a compelling way that will be listened to. I think that's an extremely powerful tool, no matter who you are.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Suzanne, do you have any closing remarks you would like to add to this? And if not, I really like something that was said in the chat, which was, Monica, I think you were messaging only to myself and Erin, but you had this lovely story about how you really resonate with Alice's story, and perhaps your science story was your ongoing quest to find out what a scientist is, and that there are more ways than the academic tenure track way of being a scientist. And then you said, I sense a submission brewing. And I think that's such a lovely, wonderful sentiment to end it on, is that there are such good stories that we can bring out of this. So on that really lovely note, oh, there's Suzanne. Hi.
And I just want to say again, as we wind down, that I've now had the privilege of listening to the Story Collider Slam and of hearing your presentations and those of colleagues. They're powerful stories and powerful lessons we all can learn. And particularly in this context, when humanizing the work we do as scientists and academics has never been more important in terms of both public sentiment, but legislative sentiment. So thanks to all of our participants, and Erin, thanks to you and your Story Collider colleagues. Sarah, thanks to you for moderating, and we will wish everybody a good Wednesday.
Thank you so
Thanks
much,
so much.
everyone. Thank you, Erin.